A city can survive weeks under siege. Some survived years. One of the sieges on this list lasted so long that children were born, grew up, and became soldiers themselves before it finally ended. Length didn't save anyone. Neither did walls, faith, or desperate pleas for help that never came, sent to allies and neighbors who had their own wars to fight and nothing left to spare. This is the story of 4 sieges that ground on for years, and one that did more damage in under 2 weeks than most of them managed in a decade, counting down toward the longest and most devastating of them all. Number 4. In June 1779, Spanish and French forces surround the British-held fortress of Gibraltar at the southern tip of Spain, determined to starve out a garrison of roughly 5,000 men and take back a piece of land Britain had held for over 70 years. The siege stretches on for more than 3.5 years, through blockades, bombardments, and 2 brutal winters where the defenders' food supplies dwindle to almost nothing, forcing soldiers to trade personal belongings for scraps of bread and salted meat. Soldiers and their families inside the fortress survive on rationed scraps, while disease, especially scurvy, kills more of them than enemy fire ever does, spreading through cramped, malnourished quarters where fresh food had become a memory. This was the Great Siege of Gibraltar, and by the time it finally ended in February 1783, roughly 1,200 British defenders had died, alongside thousands more on the attacking side who were killed trying to force their way in. The final assault came from massive floating gun batteries the attackers believed were unsinkable, armored and reinforced specifically to withstand British cannon fire. British defenders heated their cannonballs red-hot in furnaces built specifically for the purpose and fired them directly into the wooden ships, setting them ablaze from the inside until they burned to the waterline in front of thousands of horrified spectators watching from both sides, some of the crews trapped below deck as the fires spread. That siege dragged on for years and still ended in stalemate and loss. The next one on this list dragged on almost as long in a city where the enemy outside mattered less than the hunger inside. Number 3. In September 1941, German forces encircle the Soviet city of Leningrad, cutting off nearly every road, railway, and supply route into a city of more than 2.5 million people. Rather than attack directly, the German command makes a deliberate decision to starve the city into submission, understanding that hunger would do what soldiers couldn't. Winter arrives, and daily bread rations for ordinary residents fall to just 125 grams, about the weight of a small candy bar, cut with sawdust to make the flour stretch further. This was the Siege of Leningrad, and it lasted 872 days, nearly 2.5 years, broken only by a desperate supply route that residents called the Road of Life, a stretch of ice across a frozen lake that trucks crossed under constant shell fire, often falling straight through the ice with everyone aboard, their headlights briefly visible under the surface before going dark. Historians estimate that somewhere between 800,000 and 1.5 million people died during the siege, the overwhelming majority of them civilians who starved, froze, or grew too weak to survive routine illness, their bodies stacked in the streets because there was no fuel left to dig graves in the frozen ground. An 11-year-old girl named Tanya Savicheva kept a diary during those years, recording in a few short lines the deaths of her sister, her grandmother, her brother, her uncles, and finally her mother, one entry at a time, before dying herself shortly after being evacuated. Her diary survived, she did not. Even a siege that killed over 1 million people took years to do it, grinding the city down season by season. What happened next took less than 2 weeks, and it ended an entire golden age of human knowledge in a single brutal week. Number 2. In January 1258, a Mongol army under the command of Hulagu Khan surrounds Baghdad, then the intellectual and cultural capital of the Islamic world, home to the House of Wisdom, one of the greatest libraries ever assembled, holding centuries of accumulated scientific, medical, and philosophical knowledge from across 3 continents. The city's ruler refuses to surrender, badly underestimating the force outside his walls. Within 13 days, Mongol forces breached the city's defenses completely. This was the Siege of Baghdad, and what followed wasn't really a battle, it was a massacre that lasted about a week, with historians' estimates of the dead ranging from 90,000 in the most conservative accounts to as many as 1 million in the highest. A range so wide precisely because so few were left afterward to properly count the loss. Survivors described the Tigris River running black with ink from the tens of thousands of books thrown into it from the House of Wisdom, and red with the blood of the scholars, scientists, and citizens killed alongside them. Centuries of irreplaceable manuscripts, covering everything from astronomy to medicine to philosophy, gathered from Greek, Persian, and Indian traditions over 500 years, were destroyed in days. An entire civilization's accumulated memory erased faster than it could ever be rebuilt. Historians still refer to this single brief siege as the effective end of the Islamic Golden Age, a period of scientific and cultural achievement that Baghdad never fully recovered. Its population and its standing in the world diminished for centuries afterward. And yet even that catastrophe doesn't outlast the sheer grinding duration of the very last siege on this list, one that outlived entire human lifetimes. Number 1. In May 1648, Ottoman forces land on the island of Crete and begin a siege of the Venetian-held city of Candia, a fortress city considered one of the strongest and most heavily defended in the entire Mediterranean world. Neither side expects what comes next. The siege grinds on not for months, not for a few years, but 21 consecutive years, becoming one of the longest sieges ever recorded in human history. Soldiers who arrived as young men grow old inside the walls. Entire naval campaigns are fought and lost over the surrounding waters just to keep the city's supply lines open even slightly. This was the Siege of Candia, and by the time it finally ended in September 1669, the combined death toll on both sides had climbed past 100,000 people, worn down by more than 2 decades of combat, disease, and starvation that neither side could bring to a decisive end. When the city finally surrendered, an entire generation of Venetian soldiers had lived and died without ever knowing a version of Candia that wasn't under siege, their entire adult lives measured out in a war their fathers had started, and their sons would still be fighting when it finally ended. 4 sieges and 1 massacre that needed only 13 days to outdo them all. Different centuries, different continents, one unbearable truth running underneath every single one. The people trapped inside these walls very rarely got to decide how the story ended. They endured for years, in some cases for entire decades, and endurance alone was never enough to save them. What each of these places lost, in lives, in libraries, in generations that never got to grow up, is the kind of loss that doesn't get undone by a peace treaty or a surrender. It just gets counted, and then, slowly, remembered less and less with each passing year, until a diary entry from an 11-year-old girl or a river once black with ink becomes the only thing left standing between an entire tragedy and total silence. If this video moved you the way it was meant to, hit like. That tells us this kind of history deserves more of our time and yours, instead of something lighter. If you know someone who needs to sit with a story like this one, send it their way. That's how a small channel like ours reaches people it otherwise never would. And in the comments, tell us which of these 4 hit you hardest, or which forgotten tragedy you think we should tell next. We read every comment, and they genuinely shape what gets made.